Kwame Nkrumah would be disgusted by the way the West is patting itself on the back for finally having a conversation about reparations. And you might be asking why. Why would the man who led Ghana to independence, who spent his life fighting colonialism, who should be the first person celebrating that the world is finally naming the crime, why would he be disgusted? Because Nkrumah understood something that we keep forgetting. You don't debate a debt. You pay it. And when the people who owe the debt get to decide whether it should be paid, you're not having a conversation about justice. You're watching a performance. So let's break this down in 3 parts. First, we need to understand why Nkrumah believed the debt was never actually paid in the first place. Second, we need to look at what he would say about the arguments the West is making right now. The ones about not ranking atrocities, about it being too long ago, about it being unfair to people alive today. And third, we need to actually listen to what Nkrumah proposed as a solution, because it was never just about a check in the mail. It was about tearing down the whole structure. Let's start with the first one. The debt was never paid. To understand why Nkrumah would be disgusted by the reparations debate, we need to start with a simple fact. The debt was never paid. Not a penny. Not an apology. Nothing. Here's what happened. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a crime. It was the economic engine that built the modern West. Britain's Industrial Revolution was financed by sugar grown by enslaved people. The ports of Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow grew fat on the slave trade. The insurance markets, the shipping industries, the banks that would later finance the British Empire, they all got their start underwriting the transportation and sale of human beings. France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, the same story. The United States became the wealthiest nation on earth on the backs of enslaved people who produced the cotton that fueled its textile industry. Now here's the part that should make you angry. When Britain finally abolished slavery in 1833, they didn't free the enslaved and call it even. They borrowed £20 million, 40% of the entire British government's annual budget, and they paid it to the slaveholders. Compensation for lost property. The people who had been raped, branded, separated from their children, treated as livestock, they got nothing. The British government finished paying off that loan in 2015. 200 years later, the descendants of the enslaved are still waiting. Kwame Nkrumah knew this history because he didn't just read it in a book. He lived its aftermath. Ghana gained independence in 1957, but the British banks that had financed the slave trade still controlled Ghana's cocoa prices. The same banks, the same structures, the same country that had paid reparations to slaveholders now determined what Ghana earned for its primary export. Nkrumah saw that political independence without economic justice was a ceremony. The insult hiding inside polite language. Now let's talk about what the West is actually saying right now, because this is where the insult lives. The United States voted no to the UN resolution. The United Kingdom and France abstained. All 27 EU members abstained. And their arguments were almost identical. We shouldn't rank historical atrocities. The Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, the crimes of colonialism, no single set of atrocities is worse than another. And reparations are too complicated, too far in the past, unfair to people alive today who weren't there. To understand why Nkrumah would call this an insult, we need to look at what's really being said underneath the polite language. The West did not find ranking atrocities complicated when they were the ones benefiting. They didn't find it complicated when they paid the slaveholders. They didn't find it complicated when they carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference, drawing borders that had nothing to do with ethnicity or culture, designed to divide and weaken and extract. They didn't find it complicated when they loaded ships with human cargo and called it commerce. They only find it complicated now that the descendants of the enslaved are asking for what they were owed the day the chains came off. And the argument that reparations are unfair to people alive today who weren't there? Let's be honest about what that argument is really saying. If you inherit wealth from a thief, you don't get to keep it just because you didn't commit the theft yourself. That's not justice. That's laundering. The generations of wealth accumulated from stolen labor, the infrastructure built on the backs of enslaved people, the compounding interest on a debt that was never paid, all of that is still sitting there. And the people who benefit from it get to say, I didn't do it, as if that makes the money clean. Nkrumah would look at the countries that abstained, that said they support the idea but not the language, that don't want to rank atrocities or commit to a timeline for repair, and he would ask them a question they don't want to answer. If you won't even name the crime properly, if you won't acknowledge that this particular crime was unique in its scale, its duration, its systematic brutality, and its ongoing consequences that still structure the lives of millions of people today, how do you expect anyone to believe you'll ever participate in making it right? Because here's what Nkrumah understood. The refusal to name is itself a form of violence. When you say we shouldn't rank atrocities, what you're really saying is that Black suffering is not special. It's not uniquely worthy of attention. It's just one atrocity among many. And since we can't address all of them at once, we'll address none of them. And that, to Nkrumah, is the insult hiding inside the polite language. You're not protecting the memory of Holocaust victims by refusing to name the slave trade for what it was. You're using their suffering as a shield to protect your own comfort. What Nkrumah actually proposed. So if Nkrumah wouldn't accept the debate, if he wouldn't accept the polite arguments about complexity and fairness, what would he actually want? To understand that, we need to look at what he spent his life fighting for after independence. Most people know Nkrumah as the man who led Ghana to independence, but few know what he tried to do afterward. He didn't just want a flag and a seat at the UN. He wanted to tear down the entire structure. He wrote a book called Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. In it, he argued that even after independence, African nations were still dependent. Their economies were designed to export raw materials to the West and import finished goods. The same structure that existed during colonialism, just with African politicians in charge instead of European governors. He called it the tragedy of the post-colonial state. You win political freedom, but you inherit an economy that was never designed to serve your people. It was designed to serve London and Paris and Lisbon. And he saw the only way out. A United States of Africa. A continental federation with its own currency, its own military, its own economic bloc. He believed that individual African nations would never have leverage against the powers that had exploited them for centuries. Ghana alone could not renegotiate its cocoa prices. Nigeria alone could not demand fair terms for its oil. But a united Africa, with a population of over 1 billion people, with the resources to build its own infrastructure, its own manufacturing base, its own trading networks, that Africa could sit at the table not as a supplicant, but as an equal. He was overthrown in a CIA-backed coup in 1966. The United States and Britain were terrified of what he represented. A leader who said independence was not complete until the economic structure of exploitation was dismantled. A leader who said Africa's resources belonged to Africa's people, not to the corporations and banks that had profited from slavery and colonialism. He died in exile in 1972, still believing that unity was the only path. And the structure he fought against is still standing. So what would Nkrumah say about reparations today? He wouldn't see it as a check in the mail. He wouldn't see it as a symbolic apology. He would see it as a structural question. The return of looted artifacts sitting in European museums. The cancellation of debts that were incurred after centuries of extraction. The restructuring of trade agreements that still favor the former colonial powers. The investment in African infrastructure, education, healthcare, not as charity, but as payment on a debt that was never settled. He would say that if you're not willing to change the structure, you're not serious about repair. You're just trying to make yourself feel better while holding on to what was stolen.